Welcome everyone to our discussion today, Information Literacy and Related Literacies, Exploring Relationships and Future Directions. We are so excited to have you all here today with us. So folks have been sharing in the chat where they're coming from, and it's amazing to see that we have people from all over the country. Lots of folks really interested in this topic, and we hope that you will enjoy our discussion today. I'll put in the chat again, if you're interested in accessing the slides or the Padlet that we're going to use today, I'll put those links in the chat so that everyone has access to those. So just to give a quick little bit of background, so as some folks know, back in April, I helped to organize a panel discussion on celebrating 50 years of information literacy. And we had a lot of interest in that. We had a lot of questions that we were not able to answer. And so I wanted to organize some follow-up discussions to allow us to jump into some of the topics that folks were really interested in talking more about. And so we had gotten a lot of questions around connections between information literacy, media literacy, digital literacy, all of those literacies. So I wanted to give us a chance to have a more discussion focused specifically on that topic. If you are interested in seeing that panel discussion, if you missed that, I put the link to that video in the chat there. But that's just a quick little background of sort of where we came from, what we're doing here today. Some quick participation guidelines. You will have some options to be able to participate today, and your participation is definitely welcome. It's not required. We want everyone to feel comfortable. So if you would rather just sit and listen, that is totally fine as well. We do have a lot of folks here today, more than 200. So there's chances that the chat might go pretty quickly. So if you do have general comments that you would like to share, you can go ahead and add those into the chat. But if you do have specific questions that you would like our panelists to answer, we'll ask that you put those in the Q&A so that we make sure that we don't lose track of those questions as the chat moves along. We'll ask for folks not to use the raised hand feature just because we have so many folks here today. We don't really have, it can't really work out really well to allow folks to do that. But please go ahead and use that chat and use that Q&A to share your questions and comments. We also have a Padlet. I'm going to go try to escape really quickly. I put the link to the Padlet in the chat, but if you wanted to go out to that, here are some resources that we've already started to populate some resources here with some of the materials that our panelists have shared and put together. If you have resources that you would like to share as well, please feel free to add those to the Padlet, and we'll keep this as a resource. We'll send this out and make sure that everyone does have access to that afterwards. And I'll put that link in the chat there again as well, so that folks have access to that. So please go ahead and add your resources to the Padlet so we can create a shared resource together. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the slides. All right, hopefully everyone should be seeing the slides. Is that good? Okay, just making sure we're on the right page. All right, so we're going to go ahead and jump in and get to know our panelists a little bit. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and to talk a little bit about their background or their interest in this topic of the sort of related literacies. So I'll ask Spencer to go ahead and go first.
Okay, thank you, Jane. Hello, everybody. So a little bit of background about me and this work. It really started with media literacy, actually. As a fairly new librarian at a previous institution, I really wanted to focus on my teaching and my pedagogy. And so I tried to look for natural connections with faculty that would ask for information literacy sessions. And so I came across media literacy, a syllabus and learning outcomes. And I thought, wow, there's a lot of overlap between media literacy and information literacy. And so that sort of developed into co-teaching a media and information literacy course with a communications faculty member. And a lot of some of the resources we used was UNESCO's Media and Information Literacy Framework, as well as some other practical examples from other institutions, but there weren't very many. And that just sort of led me down like the past decade to really enmeshing myself in communications, media literacy, media studies, and really trying to understand more about that background so I could relate more in terms of the similarities that I find in conversations with media literacy folks, as well as the work that we all do as librarians and teaching. But what I'm still seeing after a decade is that, again, just looking at from my perspective in media literacy, is that two will have similarities, similar concerns in terms of articulating the value in what we do. We're still very much siloed and focused, sometimes more on our own work. So that's sort of where I'm coming at things. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Spencer. And next we'll move to Audrey.
Hello, my name's Audrey Gunn. I am a research and instruction librarian for natural sciences and English. Unusual combination, I know, but I really enjoy it. At St. Olaf College, and I'm really representing the work of a whole team here today. So I wanted to start off by providing some institutional context. At St. Olaf, the libraries and IT are a combined unit, and we've worked together very closely for many years. And a couple of years ago, our director of libraries and IT decided to merge the instruction librarians with the instructional technologists into one department. At St. Olaf, our instructional technologists provide classroom instruction on topics like GIS, poster design, makerspace projects, that kind of thing. So there are a lot of parallels in the way that we work with faculty and students. And we've been a combined department for 2 years now. Even before departments merged, we'd been talking for years about how to better explain our work to faculty and to really define what brings us together as a group. And before the pandemic, the libraries and IT had a strategic planning group looking at our role in teaching digital literacy skills to the campus. That group was very inspired by Bryn Mawr College's digital competencies framework, as well as Baylor University's Literacies guide. So both of those are in the Padlet. But the strategic planning work ended up on pause, of course, during the pandemic, and then resumed in 2023 when our department received a grant from NetView, which is the Network for Vocation and Undergraduate Education, to develop a literacies framework at St. Olaf. So for the past year, our department has been meeting for regular retreats to develop a literacies framework that will help explain to faculty and the broader campus community what it is that we're focused on teaching when we work with students.
Thank you so much, Audrey. All right, and next we'll move to Melissa.
Thank you, Jane. It's so good to be here and see a lot of friendly names in the audience. I'm Melissa Mallon. I'm Associate University Librarian for Teaching and Learning at Vanderbilt University. And my whole career has been centered around information literacy in some way, shape, or form, like I think many of us here. But I really started getting more interested in the other literacies, which we'll talk about today, especially digital and media literacies, when I started having conversations with my educator siblings. So my sister teaches 5th grade, and my brother is a professor of peace and conflict studies. And we really started thinking about what it looks like to focus on being an informed citizen of the world from that kind of early K-12 perspective all the way up through higher ed and then and beyond. So this kind of spectrum of lifelong learning. And so I started getting really interested in that and thinking about the ways, sort of like Spencer and Audrey were saying, that we can infuse that work into our teaching and our partnerships with faculty, and just helping our students think about what it means to be an informed citizen and engaged citizen in terms of information consumption and creation, and how that all kind of fits together in one little piece of the puzzle. And then I would be remiss if I did not give a shout out to a group I'm a part of called the New Literacies Alliance. That is a consortium of university libraries that are creating some open access tutorials related to all of these different types of literacies. And I put a link to that in the Padlet so everybody could access that. So I just wanted to give a little shout out there too.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And then last but not least, Sarah.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Jane. So I sort of came into my interest in all these different literacies actually before I became a librarian. So I worked as a museum educator before starting my career in libraries, and we worked really heavily with sort of STEM education and lots of digital literacy and some media literacy. So I kind of had that exposure before I started my MLIS program, and I was really struck once I started it about the amount and degree of overlap with information literacy and these other literacies I'd been working with. So I think it sort of set me off on a path of being intrigued about kind of, as you said, Spencer, sort of breaking down some of these silos and sort of identifying connections between different educator groups and the different literacies we're all kind of grappling with and exploring in our work. I spent most of my career for the past 10 years in library instruction, most recently at Emory University. But as of late, I've actually been working at the Carter Center here in Atlanta, which is affiliated with the Carter Presidential Library. And it's been a really interesting opportunity to do work more explicitly around media literacy and exploring all those connections with information literacy. We work closely with libraries, higher education institutions, as well as K through 12 environments and other civics education organizations, civil society groups, and things like that. So it's been a real, I think, interesting space to kind of explore these concepts further that we'll be talking about today on the panel.
All right, thank you so much. All right, so we'll go ahead and jump into our questions. So, we had a poll really quickly. So some of the comments that we got with the original panel discussion that we gave back in April was about sort of how these sort of literacies are connected to each other. Should they be kind of under the umbrella of information literacy or distinct in some way? So we wanted to give the audience a chance to share their perspective really quickly on that. So I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll really quickly and let everyone have a chance to share. So the question is going to be, should literacies such as media literacy, digital literacy, algorithmic literacy, should those be considered part of or distinct from information literacy? So we'll launch that poll and we'll let everyone have a chance to share their response there. So we're getting really great participation. So we'll give it just a few more seconds to let everyone share their response. So it does look like the responses are slowing down. So we'll go ahead and end that poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, so share the results. So we see the majority of folks, 78% say that those literacies should be considered part of information literacy. I have about 9% that say they should be considered distinct from information literacy, and about 13% who are not sure. So thank you all for sharing your responses there. We'll stop sharing that. And then we'll kind of build off of that and sort of take that question to our panelists. So as folks that have been, looking into these issues and topics for the last few years, I want to hear your perspective. Do you see literacies such as digital literacy, media literacy, or other related literacies as falling under the umbrella of information literacy, or do you see those as being distinct from information literacy? So any of our panelists that would like to jump in first, you can feel free.
I guess I'll kick us off. Somebody has to start, right? So I think they are all interconnected. Absolutely. I agree with the attendees that are saying in the chat that there's a lot of overlap between all of these different components. I am, to be honest, still a little unconvinced it's all under one umbrella. To me, it's like little arms of an octopus or something kind of floating around out there. Like it's connected, but everything, sort of has its own distinct definition as well. I think that for me, it's less thinking about information literacy as a term. And I know we're going to dig into this a little bit more later in the panel, but it's this idea of looking at what it means to be a critical thinker, to be someone that knows how to be conversant in any type of media, and in any way that information is being created or shared. And so thinking about like how that information ecosystem exists, from the algorithms that help you find or not find information that may exist, to the types of tools that you can use to, create a podcast or to create a research paper, or a digital poster or something like that, the actual kind of so-called information literacy skills of finding information to put on that poster. So yeah, okay, I'm going to start rambling. So one of the other panelists jump in.
I can go. So I really like that this question was included in the panel because it was one of the questions that came up immediately for our group. We had originally identified 9 literacies that St. Olaf department members played a role in teaching. Not all of those made the final cut, but the original 9 were infolit, data lit, AI literacy, maker, media, visual, oral, that's AURAL, St. Olaf's a big music school, essential technology, and primary source literacies. And to the librarians on the team, it seemed really obvious that all of these other literacies fell under the umbrella of infolit, whereas this perspective came as a surprise to some of our instructional technologists. But as we talked more, I think our instructional technologists began to understand information literacy more expansively. There were a couple of articles by librarians that were really influential in our thinking here, including Mackey and Jacobson's article on reframing information literacy as a meta-literacy. That's a great read. I would recommend it. But as these discussions continued, we came to see information literacy not in a hierarchical manner, kind of as you were mentioning, Sarah, where information literacy was somehow above the other literacies, but rather seeing information literacy as central. So we're still working on developing a final visualization for this project, but that's the plan, is to have information literacy at the center of the graphic with all of the others forming a circle around it. And in terms of how librarians should approach teaching and advocating for information literacy, I think being able to define our work to faculty and administrators in clear, simple terms is one of the best things that we can do. That's one of the things that we at St. Olaf loved about Bryn Mawr's framework, is that they have a very simple graphic which lays out their digital competencies and shows how they relate to each other, as well as giving folks the ability to explore any one particular competency in more detail. So we're hoping that our graphic will similarly give collaborators a snapshot of the work we do, help faculty see that our definition of infolit encompasses way more than just being able to search databases for peer-reviewed articles, and hopefully helps them better understand the variety of ways that we can collaborate with them as instructors.
Audrey, I really like your positioning of information literacy sort of in the center. I feel this is a great opportunity to adopt Melissa's octopus model, so you could have little tentacles. It could be the way forward, the octopus literacy conception.
Oh yes, apologies. Credit to you, Melissa, for your octopus idea.
I love it.
Is there a graphic designer in the house? Can someone get working on that?
we got a mascot now, so we're really ready to roll. But no, I agree with both of you. I really see, as you note, Audrey, not like a hierarchical connection, but the fact that these all have sort of interconnectivity and relations together. One thing I've been kind of thinking about lately in my work is, really looking at critical thinking as perhaps sort of a common foundation among all of these literacies that can be used to open up conversations with different groups. Something that struck me recently is how so many different groups, we're talking about different literacies, and you can see areas of distinction, but also a lot of overlap. And sometimes it's sort of just a matter of perhaps terms not landing with one audience versus another. And so maybe finding those sort of commonalities and perhaps framing critical thinking as sort of a shared foundation amongst all of these things and looking at those interconnections that way. So that's something I've been thinking about lately. But yeah, Spencer, anything to add there? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I like how we're talking about these not necessarily under an umbrella or one is under the other one or what that might be. I appreciate that. I was a similar question at a media literacy conference last week where we're trying to like fit this all and got to no answers, right? So I really like that changing perspective. I think too, and this is a quote that I sometimes come back to about a researcher who's not a librarian, but wrote that, these umbrella terms are sometimes seemingly futile. People tend to assume their favorite term includes every other one. But I think kind of what's different in terms of librarians, at least, coming from my approach in terms of the media literacy world, is that we do, we're not afraid to kind of connect and touch on them all, rather than sort of looking just inward at information literacy, which is, I think, something of value. But again, I think some of that challenge is still that while we may not remain siloed in that work, I think we would come up against that sometimes, not all the time, but there are situations where we come up against that siloing if we want to partner and connect.
Great, thanks so much. So we do actually have one question in the Q&A that I think it might be helpful to address now. Stephen asked if any of the panelists could explain why all of these literacies are not under the umbrella of digital literacy. So it seems that InfoLit is part of being an informed digital citizen. Anyone like to address that question?
I can address part of it, which is that for us, we felt that there's a lot of forms of information out there that are not digital, that our students are engaging with. Our special collections librarian in particular was very vocal about saying digital literacy isn't the only kind of instruction we provide.
Yeah, I think that sort of goes to what we were saying just a few minutes ago about not being under the information literacy umbrella, right? That none of these pieces are any more hierarchical than the others, that they can kind of coexist. And, to Spencer's point, I think it can make it hard to communicate with faculty when we're trying to talk about like where this all fits, because there's for the most part, an established idea that librarians can help with information literacy. So I think it is like really examining how we talk about the skills and the behaviors and the competencies, maybe pulling away from just the kind of the phrasing of blank literacy and more thinking about, do you want to be a critical thinker, or do you want your students to learn how to be critical thinkers, et cetera?
Share one comment in the chat as well. I wanted to highlight. So Glenn had shared, I like InfoLit because it focuses on information as a key component, whereas critical thinking doesn't. So I don't know how folks might feel about that one as well, but I thought that was an interesting comment there as well. So as we move into the next question here, so moving away from necessarily trying to define how these literacies connect, the next question that we wanted to focus on is what librarians might be able to learn from research in areas like media literacy, digital literacy, other literacies that folks have looked into that would be helpful or valuable for thinking about how we either conceptualize or practice information literacy. So any of the panelists?
I would just jump in to say that, and probably Spencer will talk a little bit more about this, I'm going to guess, just looking to our faculty counterparts, there's a lot of research being done on media and digital literacies that has lots of room for librarians to be involved in. And so he has done a lot of good work on trying to bridge that gap between the librarians and faculty and how we can all kind of coalesce together. So I think that there's a lot happening that we can look to that will help us think about maybe disciplinary perspectives for how we can approach some of these questions and concepts. And then I also think we just need to look outside of the academy too. There's a lot of really great work happening across Europe and Australia and in the global South, thinking about how to equip just citizens with skills to navigate their lives and to navigate the world. And a lot of that is grounded in research, but some of it is just life experience. And so I think that we can learn a lot from some of our colleagues in other areas outside of the academy as well.
I guess I'll go. I think, you know, and this is just purely personal based on the work that I've done. I think it's helpful because there's at least for me, right? Like there's a collaborative approach to it. So it's always nice to have a colleague, whether it's a librarian or somebody else that you're working with, to bounce ideas off of, to improve teaching, the research, and sort of how that work is evolving. Um, I think there again, sort of the theme that's coming so far today is that you know, that ability to connect with others, to really understand. But at a lot of times we're so busy that this is actually really difficult. We don't have a lot of time to really enmesh ourselves in another area to really learn that. And so, you know, although valuable, I recognize, you know, that's you know, in terms of my situation, was a lucky thing to happen where you have a faculty colleague who wants to also learn about information literacy, who wants to go to library conferences and vice versa to learn about that work. And so I think it just sort of broadens your perspective in terms of how you're teaching and working with students, to sort of learn from each other in that sort of valuable relationship. You know, I did want to just, if I could just respond as well to the Glenn's, you know, question or comment. I think too, like, you know, the one about InfoLit, because it focuses on information as a key component, whereas critical thinking doesn't. I think what we then start to see is the critical information literacy, the critical media literacy. You know, again, at this conference I was at last week, there was sort of, I think, critical disinformation literacy, like, you know, applying all these things. And so you can kind of see what the path that we could go down, and then how people start to get siloed with some of these things.
Thank you so much. Sarah, Audrey?
Yeah, Melissa, I'm really glad you brought up sort of looking outside the academy, as it were, because I think there's a lot of interesting work happening. I think this sort of flew by in the chat, but Ashley mentioned sort of overlap between the real world, quote unquote, and the academic world. But I think there's some valuable and interesting perspectives to be had in those spaces, and to really sort of look at perhaps these broader information ecosystems as a whole, and sort of different ways of participating and consuming information and engaging in conversations. A lot of the work I've been doing lately, it's been interesting the degree to which some of these terms go completely by the wayside, and the concern is sort of around civic engagement or online privacy and security, as well as grappling with mis and disinformation or community, and they're all kind of just bound up together, and no one's really sort of all that concerned about parsing some of the distinctions. It's sort of centered around goals around what are critical thinking or democracy initiatives or things of that nature. So that framing, I think, has been sort of eye-opening. I'll also just add that, you know, Spencer, back to your point around sort of different academic disciplines, I think it can be helpful to kind of consider the language and discussions they're having. I think too often librarians can get maybe left out of conversations or not always getting a seat at the table. So if there's ways we could position ourselves and sort of make it really explicit to other researchers or people interested in these topics, the expertise we have and how we can contribute and what information literacy is and how it connects, I think those can be really helpful things to consider as well in our own research and pedagogical work and things of that nature.
Yeah, at St. Olaf, that's something we've been planning to do and we're hoping to do by now, but you know, best laid plans of mice and librarians. But we were hoping to have conversations with other campus partners, both instructional faculty has been mentioned a lot, but also people like the director of our art museum, the director of the writing center, director of civic engagement, career center, and so on, to think about how all of us who are in these roles that are kind of borderline between strictly academic and a little more broadly expansive in what we're teaching to the campus could be included. We've been really thinking of our framework as being lifelong literacies, you know, something that we want students to take with them and carry throughout their lives. And I think having those conversations will really help us to add to the framework we've got so far.
I haven't fully articulated this thought yet, but hearing everybody just made me think about this. There's a quote by by Andrew Whitworth, who I think is a faculty researcher in the UK in 2017. He wrote like he says, can libraries LIS give up information literacy, or at least recognize that it is a notion that spreads well beyond their own landscape, even if this would strengthen, not only weaken their position. So I think how we what sort of the value in terms of how we conceptualize or practice information literacy. I think there's something there to think about in terms of partnership or learning together with whether it's faculty or Audrey made a great point, other areas on campus that, hey, they might be doing some of this stuff. So what else could we do to make that partnership more powerful?
I think one way to look at that too is thinking about all of the initiatives that are coming up on campuses that are sort of in the information literacy kind of orbit, I guess. So like at Vanderbilt, we have a fairly new office called, I'm going to mess up the name, Project on Unity and Democracy, I think, the Unity Project. And it's basically about getting people citizens to have productive dialogue and conversations and to sort of see where other folks' perspectives are coming from. And that is a perfect place to infuse media literacy, right? So thinking about how you engage with information, especially in an election cycle, there's a lot of rich content there to talk about. And so just sort of thinking about ways that you can kind of complete that bridge that may not be part of the curriculum, right? That is something that's happening kind of on the co-curricular side. I think to Spencer's point, just like keeping your eyes open and knowing that there are folks on campus that would extremely value your contribution.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly. I mean, in terms of campus trends, I'm sure we've all been experiencing the sort of explosion of interest around AI in particular, and now all these calls for AI literacy and prompt literacy. And I think it was Buckingham. I could have the person wrong, but I remember reading something way back in library school where it argued literacy is an overburdened term, as in so we just keep piling all these different forms on it to the point where you're sort of wondering, what on earth are we talking about at this point? But I think, Melissa, to your point, kind of keeping an eye on those either co-curricular spaces or shifts in curriculum. I noticed some institutions lately, they've been looking at entrepreneurship as sort of an initiative or value or something they want to kind of explore with students. So finding those, I think, areas as well to kind of position the library or see where information literacy and our understanding of it could perhaps, play a role, or we could make that more explicit to different partners.
Wonderful. So I think that leads very well in to this next question here. So we wanted to talk about this question sort of whether or not we should be using one of these other terms, right? So should we de-emphasize information literacy, at least, maybe when we're talking to others, and should we adopt one of these other terms as instead, such as digital literacy or media literacy? So we wanted to give you all a chance first to share your thoughts on there. So we know this could be potentially a little bit controversial for some folks. So we'll go ahead and go back here. So we're going to launch this second poll, right? And again, the question is, should we stop using information literacy and try to adopt one of these other terms? All right, so we'll give it a few more seconds here. It looks like participation slowing down a little bit. So we'll go ahead and get ready to end this poll in, let's see, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. So hopefully folks should be able to see the results. So we have about 49% who disagree, with additional 15% who strongly disagree. So the majority of folks on the disagree side of that question, but a good chunk, about a quarter of folks that are neutral on that question, and then a smaller amount who agree or strongly agree that we should adopt one of the other terms. And if folks that are supporting adopting a different term, we'd love to see in the chat which term you would prefer us to use for sure. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And then I will go ahead and turn this same question over to the panelists. What are your thoughts on de-emphasizing information literacy in favor of adopting one of the other terms?
When people suggest that we move away from terms like information literacy in favor of something like digital literacy, I think it often stems from the perception that digital literacy is a more familiar phrase to faculty and maybe a sexier term than infolit. And because of that, this question makes me think about how I approach the issue of jargon in library instruction sessions. You know, instruction librarians are often encouraged to avoid using terms that might be unfamiliar to the students we're teaching. And I definitely think there are times when doing so can make our instruction more accessible. But I also think it can be empowering for our users to learn and begin to use our disciplinary language. It can create a sense of belonging and confidence in that discipline. And as a general rule, I think most people in higher ed, at least, like learning new things. So I don't think that we, either as a profession or at our institutions, necessarily need to move away from the term infolit, but we do have to be prepared to explain it and need to seek out opportunities to explain it at new faculty orientations, department meetings, that kind of thing. So I think part of the decision here has to be related to your institutional context. Do you have the time and access needed to explain infolit? If not, you may want to go with a term that has more brand recognition, and that's perfectly legitimate. The other thing I would say here is that I really don't think this is an either or question. At St. Olaf, for example, we positioned both media and digital literacy as falling within our broader understanding of infolit. And this has enabled us to pick the most relevant literacies for various discussions with faculty while maintaining a consistent understanding of each term across our department.
Yeah, I want to emphasize that the either or. I've seen a couple of people say this in the chat too. I think it can be contextual, but again, going back to what we were saying earlier, that and I think I actually saw a question in the Q&A about like the term literacy, right? Is that the right word to be using? Does that kind of complicate matters a little bit? Because a lot of people do think literacy is knowing how to read, which is an important part of all of this, right? So I don't know. I actually was making notes for myself on the questions that Jane had sent us, and I wrote, I feel like we need a new word for all of this. And then I could not finish it. I don't know. I don't know what the word should be. But I do think it's an important one to discuss, especially when we're talking about jargon and who we're trying to reach and what the point of all of this is, right?
Yeah, I love Veronica's question. And I think it came up again in discussions last week that is it just rhetoric? Is adding the term literacy just rhetoric? But is it a useful piece of rhetoric for us? Which I think is interesting to think about. And I think sometimes when we do the either or, I think it minimizes the work a little bit and maybe makes it too simplistic than what it actually is.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you all said here. And I know many people in the chat kind of mentioned the either or sort of dichotomy, perhaps not serving well in this space. So yeah, I definitely think, I think as you have all said, it can just be important to determine sort of where you're at or what kind of conversation you're in, and kind of, keep an ear out for different terms that might be used or kind of opportunities to open the door for those conversations about how all these things connect. So I almost feel we sort of we don't want to sort of pigeonhole ourselves into a certain term that we're so, you know, emphatic about using. But we also don't want to do ourselves a disservice by not maybe articulating how the work we're doing, you know, connects and associates to these other trends. So yeah, Melissa, I kind of agree with you that we need a new term. I don't know what on earth it would be, but I almost feel there's some other language. We're almost like limited in our vocabulary to some extent here, but a conversation for another day, perhaps. So.
Well, and I think too about like the different types of audiences that we may be working with. So one of my colleagues and I taught a class for our it's the Osher Lifelong Learning Program, and we have a subset of that at Vanderbilt. And so it was mostly you know, people 60 and over. Our class was about media literacy, and we had a whole discussion at the beginning about what that means. And I think it landed, but it wasn't until we started getting into the actual components of what we were talking about, like knowing where your data is being tracked and how it's being used, and how you can spot deep fakes, or, you know, think about the way information is being produced. That's when we really got the traction, right? When we're talking about actual skills and behaviors, not when we're throwing around the term media literacy. And so I think there is something to think about there. This, you know, maybe we had a couple of academics in the class, but they were mostly just regular folks. So I think that can be a piece of it too, is trying to get at what's behind wanting to define this, or using the term, like what are we trying to get at there?
Great. So wonderful. So I think that that kind of leads us right into the Q&A. And so Melissa, you had mentioned that there's a question in the Q&A about this term literacy. So I wanted to raise that question and see if you all have any thoughts there. So Veronica had shared why literacy. So why does literacy become the default add-on to learning about new topics? And I'll mention just my own example really quickly. I've been contacted more than once by a faculty member on our campus who teaches literacy and who has been very upset about my using the term information literacy and has tried to tell me to stop teaching information literacy. So people have strong feelings about what that word means. So any additional thoughts that the panel would like to share about sort of this term literacy, and why we use it, and if that's like the appropriate term that we should be using?
Jane, your comment about that faculty member kind of made me laugh because I encountered something similar. I recently finished up a master's in English through the University of Wyoming, and I was talking to a faculty member there over the summer who runs a PhD program in literacy education. And she was she wasn't opposed, but she was baffled to this idea that literacy meant something other than the ability to read. And so I think, as I said earlier, if we are going to use this term, we have to be ready to define it for people. The other thing I wanted to say, though, is that one phrase that our group came across, actually pre-pandemic, when we were still working on a digital literacy strategic planning sort of thing, was the phrase digital dexterity. And that's one that really resonated with a lot of folks on our team. And so if we do need an alternative term, maybe we should be looking at information dexterity or something like that.
I like dexterity. I think somebody mentioned information fluency in the chat, and I've seen sort of news fluency and other kind of usages of that term. But I had a similar experience. One of my best friends is a first grade teacher, and we always laugh because her conception of literacy is quite different than what we're doing in higher education. But yeah, I agree with you, Audrey, just sort of making sure we're being clear about the meaning of that, and perhaps being prepared with synonyms, as it were, to sort of better articulate that. I did notice, I will say in the chat, there was some conversation going on about high school to college transitions, and information literacy in those spaces. So I'm not sure if we want to kind of, as a panel, address some of that, but if we want to do another question in the actual Q&A first, but just wanted to flag that I saw some interesting conversations about that. And we can certainly dive into some of that if people are interested. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's actually a question in the Q&A. Curious to Sarah's perspective experience in regard to high school students transitioning to college. So are you familiar with approaches that high school instructors use? How do you see this impacting students' literacy going into college? So Sarah, if you wanted to start, and then if other folks
sure. I was going to say, I'd love to hear other people's perspectives here as well. And I know, Spencer, especially if you're working in media literacy education spaces, I'm sure you've sort of encountered maybe work being done in the K through 12 arena. Shout out to NAMELY, which is the National Association of Media Literacy Educators. They're a great resource if you just want to see the conversations happening around media lit, maybe a little more focused at the K through 12 level. But I'll just say this is something I'm really interested in continuing to explore more. I think, speaking of silos, I feel like there's a lot of opportunity for, say, high school librarians and librarians working at the college level to kind of learn from one another's standards, whether it's the framework on the college side or the AASL standards on the K through 12 side. I've done some work looking at things like Common Core standards and things as well, just to kind of try to get a sense of the types of projects students are expected to work on. I really think there's a lot that could be done to kind of either align some of our expectations or just be more aware of the types of assignments students might be getting, in high school versus when they hit, their first year of college. Someone I think I saw mentioned, gaps in between attending college as well. And that transition can be different if you're coming from the workforce back into school. But one thing that's always sort of struck me a little, kind of working in K through 12 environments, and this is just some surface level impressions, but both the emphasis on perhaps more facility with different tools to communicate. For instance, I worked with a class one time using stop motion animation and fun ways to just kind of tell stories or communicate ideas. And sort of the ways in which maybe a research project can look different than when you're at sort of the college level, or for instance, maybe you haven't been given any sort of topic at all. And we've talked with, students being sort of at sea with having all of these demands suddenly as researchers kind of thrust upon them. So I think, I'll just say sort of looking at that scaffolding and having those conversations among ourselves, and whether that's delving into media literacy more or thinking about what information literacy looks like in both of those spaces, I think can just really help benefit the profession as a whole and the work we're doing around information literacy. And that was rather rambly, so I'll turn it over to my other panelists now if you have things to add or things you've experienced. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say, I mentioned this at the beginning, but talking with my sister who teaches 5th grade, it's funny when we have discussions about, especially digital literacy, but media literacy as well. And she's like, our kindergartners know how to make videos. This is not like something new that, they're learning when they get to college. And so I think a big part of it is, really, to Sarah's point, paying attention to what is happening in K-12, looking at the many organizations that are out there that are doing really great work and providing good curricular resources for teachers and librarians. And then I think I saw someone in the chat mentioned just talking with their high school librarians in their community and seeing, especially if you have a lot of students that are coming into your university from your community, what are they doing? What are they focusing on? And then what does that look like for us to kind of help with that continuum?
Yeah, in terms of from the media literacy perspective, there are states that have certain legislation now requiring some of this at K through 12. And so, I'm on an organization here in Illinois that's trying to do that work, but it's very hard to spread, across the state, but and to do that training on top of everything else. But certainly there are opportunities. I think that in terms of, coming from a community college and dual credit, We get dual credit classes to visit, and so there's definitely opportunities there. I think too, sometimes in terms of maybe, teaching students to sort of question and maybe doubt information, right? I think there's sort of those more critical perspectives, but I still think in terms of what we're talking, the topic right now is this question, those skills-based things are still important. I think sometimes they can be not seen as much in a positive light sometimes, but I think there's still basis for that work.
Great. So we have a couple questions in the Q&A. Jennifer asked, in a webinar last week, which was on AI literacy and information literacy, considerations for the future. So some folks may have been to that one. So my colleague, Michael Floral, gave that presentation, and he suggested that we need to adapt our theories about information literacy to the new reality of AI, rather than trying to integrate AI into information literacy. Any panelists have any thoughts on that?
I have to read that question because it seems confusing.
I know, so I'm like ruminating right now.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know that I have an answer to that necessarily. I think it goes into what we've been talking about, that, sort of a chicken and egg situation. What comes first? What's under what umbrella? I don't know. What do the rest of you think?
So I didn't see this, full
Yeah.
disclosure. To me, it seems, and maybe this is just because it's my train of thought and something that I've been thinking about recently, but like it seems to kind of be related to the umbrella terms kind of a thing, right? Like, do we integrate it or what's the best approach? It seems like that kind of a dialogue or conversation, I guess. So I don't really have a good answer, but
No, Spencer, I think I agree with you. I feel like maybe it's not so much the question of what you're sort of putting one into the other, but I do like what he said, and I will say I didn't see this webinar either, but I like what he said about sort of the new reality of AI, and I feel it can be important to consider that information literacy isn't static. It's part of an living and evolving ecosystem of information and media and all of these things, so that it, having that sort of flexibility to adapt to new ways of communicating or new forms of information, etc., I think can be really beneficial. But yeah, I'm not, yeah, maybe it is sort of an either or proposition. I'm not really quite sure what the exact relationship between those literacies should be, but I did appreciate that aspect of the quote there. Yeah.
So we have another question here. So William asks, with the need for student help relating dis or misinformation, its insertion into American and international civics, and the likelihood dis or misinformation will grow in a hyper-politicized government, at what point do we see civic literacy becoming a necessary part of InfoLit? Or is it separate from how we think about InfoLit?
I think it's there already. I mean, I think it's part of how you think about the background of information, how you consider the way biases play a role in how information is created and shared. I don't know that it's necessarily been emphasized very heavily in across, all K-16. But I personally, on my campus, we're seeing a lot more about this now, and I think we're gonna see a lot more about it. So I feel like it's always been there, but it just maybe we haven't thought about it as an explicit thing.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think civic literacy is inherently part of information literacy, but I don't know that we always make that pathway obvious for students. You know, we teach them InfoLit in different contexts and kind of hope that they'll figure out how to apply it in the context of civic duties and reading news media related to politics and that kind of thing. And that's something that maybe we could do more of. I'm sure there's someone out there doing some of that work already. But yeah, I think that would be an interesting topic to explore.
Yeah, a media literacy or media studies professor who's an emeritus now was talking sort of along this topic last week, sort of talking about how we're defining sort of political problems with disinformation and sort of relationships between elites and people. And I think getting sort of to the point quickly, I think it was sort of that if we see that only as information, that oversimplifies these issues, and that is to assume that that's going to be an easy fix is also, I think, too simple for us to see.
All right, so we've got just a couple more minutes, so we'll kind of close it out with a question about sort of advocacy. So how do we make change? How do we advocate for change? What are there organizations that you folks recommend? Resources that you would recommend? So where do we go from here? How do we advocate?
Get outside the librarian bubble. I think that getting to know our instructional technologists better, and they come from a huge variety of backgrounds, you know, so we've got people with GIS specialties and MFAs and all sorts of different connections to other ways of thinking. I think that's brought a lot to my work as a librarian, and collaborating with them more closely has also brought me into some of their organizations. So for example, I sometimes will review proposals for EDUCAUSE now. And that's another organization that's been doing a lot of fabulous work related to literacies that I don't know that I would have found my way to naturally on my own.
Yeah, I would 100% agree. And +1 to you, Audrey, getting outside the library bubble. I think kind of working where I am right now, it's been really fascinating to be sort of outside that space. And it's also been heartening that how many people get enthusiastic when they hear I'm a librarian or have questions about the work we do in libraries. So I just feel there's so many opportunities for collaboration and connection kind of outside of our own arena. And just to go back really quickly to the sort of civic literacy question, I agreed with all of you that I think it's been implicit, but I could see that being an avenue for advocacy and things going forward to kind of make more explicit how the work we're doing perhaps connects to sort of goals and issues and needs around things like civic participation and engagement. So those are just 2 thoughts there. Yeah.
I want to just give a shout out for going beyond our librarian bubbles, but then also going beyond our geographic bubbles. So thinking about the great work that's happening across the world with media, digital information and literacy. The International Council for Media Literacy does a conference every year. It's amazing. I think getting that perspective that's not just North America is going to be one way that we can really advocate for change in a much bigger scale.
Yeah, I think that the importance of cross-disciplinary dialogue, and I remember being so uncomfortable in that because I didn't know at the beginning. So you really have to, you might not get it from the person you're working with, but you really kind of have to learn the background of that discipline a little bit, and it can be super uncomfortable, but that's where sort of that growth happens, where these sort of partnerships can flourish when we start learning about these other organizations.
Wonderful. So we've reached the end of our time. So I want to thank all of our panelists for their willingness to spend their time with us today. So folks, please join me in thanking Spencer, Sarah, Melissa, and Audrey for joining us today. So thank you all for joining us today. Hope
Jane,
everyone
can I
has
give
a-
you a shout out? I don't
Oh.
think you're getting enough of a shout out for putting
Oh.
together this incredible series. There's been amazing conversations, and I just want to say thank you because this is so cool to see.
Oh, thank you so much, Melissa. I really appreciated it. So yeah, looking forward to seeing folks at the upcoming sessions, and have a wonderful day, everyone.